Professor Dr. Subhajit Sengupta, our ex-student, and at present teaching at Burdwan University. This is a special occasion, I think, for the first year boys. I think that they are going to experience the first seminar in this department. The others may have already experienced these kinds of seminars, but this seminar is also special in the sense that we have an ex-student. Since he's an ex-student, Subhajit is an ex-student of this department. He studied English honors here from 91 to 94. But he's also one of those students who has spent 5 years here. He did his +2 course also in this college. We had at that time +2 also being taught at this college. As an ex-student, he knows the academic environment of this college, the academic environment of this department, and more importantly, the psychology of the students and the profile of the students that we usually get in our department. But so far as Subhajit himself is concerned, he will feel embarrassed, but he is one of the best students that I have come across in my teaching career. Not just because of his academic qualities, his academic achievements later in his life, but also Subhajit as a man. He's a complete man in that sense. It strikes me now, it crosses my mind, that many years back, when he was at Jadavpur, he did his drama courses under famous professor of drama and Professor Anandulal. Anandulal himself directed plays when he was teaching at Jadavpur. So one of the plays was Man, and Subhajit did the role of Bluntschli. In case you have read Man, you will know who Bluntschli is, right? And the final lines of the play is, "What a man." Some character, Sergius, I think, is saying about Bluntschli, but I'm not sure whether it's Bluntschli or Bluntschli. Anyway, what a man! Is he a man? So, you also truly, what a man! Is he a man? He's a brilliant student, and more than that, I have seen brilliant students with great academic achievements. Sometimes somehow gets stunted in the course of their journey. Subhajit has not. For him, knowledge is a continuing process. Learning is a continuing process. He is both a professor and a student. I admire him so much. He studied in this department. He also taught in this department for many years. And in the later years, when he had hardly any time to come here, he taught only in the PG department. He did not teach Tempest, he taught King Lear. And I attended his classes along with the PG semester, 3 boys. I attended those classes of King Lear. And I have this very bad habit of visiting UK almost every year. And I have a very colonial mental setup. You will blame me for that. And I attended a summer course in Cambridge, where one entire course was on King Lear. I compared the notes of Subhajit and the summer course that I attended, which was taught by a English scholar. Subhajit was much, much, much better. I am not flattered. Today we will speak on Tempest. He's a Shakespeare. Specifically, in particular, he is a Shakespeare scholar. And therefore, it comes within his right to speak on Shakespeare plays. Today we will be speaking on Tempest. First year students might, there is a feeling among our students maybe I don't know why the room is very small to accommodate all our students. But sometimes the students do not come. এটা তো আমাদের সিলেবাসে নেই, এটা কেন করবো? But he's not talking only about the Tempest, he's talking about Shakespeare, he's talking about Shakespeare's Tempest, he's talking about Shakespeare's dramatic romances, and which has also ingredients of comedy there. So and these things, be it dramatic romance or be it comedy, they have their tropes which come back again and again, recur again and again. And of course it is very lovely to hear Subhajit. Fascinating English. Anyway, I think I've already embarrassed him so much that he is querying it. So over to Subhajit. Subhajit, thank you for coming. Please, your turn. Not Shakespeare's turn. Make a motion?
Thank you, sir, for your very kind words of introduction. And it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to try and live up to the expectations that you have generated in the audience. But thank you from the core of my heart for reliving some of the old memories and also for being so kind in your appreciation. Yes, I'm supposed to speak on the Tempest, and as I speak on the Tempest, I'll keep referring to some of my notes here. Now, for the uninitiated, The Tempest is one of the last 4 plays that Shakespeare wrote in what was, as you all know, a very productive career as a playwright. He started writing sometime either in the late 1580s. We do not know which play he wrote first. It could have been the 3rd part of Henry VI. Some say he began with the 3rd part of Henry VI and proceeded to write the 1st and the 2nd parts. It could have been the 1st part of Henry VI. His first tragedy probably was Titus Andronicus. His first comedy probably was The Taming of the Shrew. But there are differences of opinion regarding the chronology of Shakespeare's plays. For a long time it was believed that The Tempest was the last play that Shakespeare wrote, and while that may be true, there is hardly any evidence to back such a claim, and conjecture can never replace facts. And the strong ground that critics for a long time had for reckoning that The Tempest was the last play by Shakespeare was that there are speeches in The Tempest which sound like Shakespeare's farewell to the theatre. And this is a much quoted phrase, oft repeated by critics and by theatre lovers, about The Tempest being, quote unquote, Shakespeare's farewell to the theatre. And the reason for that is a speech towards the end of the play by Prospero, who, again, for many critics of The Tempest, is the Shakespeare figure in the play, and some see him as Shakespeare's spokesperson. Now, this speech here by Prospero, just a moment. The speech where he talks about the unsubstantial nature of things. And there he says that the revels, all the merriment, all the fun has come to an end. This is towards the close of the play. If I open up the right page at a later stage, I'd read the passage for you. But this section of the speech begins with, "Our revels now are ended. These are actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless subject of this vision, etc., etc., they're all faded." Now, this was seen for a long time, and there's a reference to the world as the great globe itself, etc. They're all melted, faded, and this was seen for a long time, since the play was supposedly performed at the Globe Theatre around 1611. This was seen as a pun on globe, the globe referring both to the world, which is the immediate meaning in the context of the play, and also at the Globe Theatre, which is the other possible meaning in the context of theatrical performance. And the audience at the time would have been acutely aware of both possible meanings of the word. So critics decided, and were very firm for a long time in their conjecture, that this was the last play that Shakespeare wrote. But of course that view now has been supplanted by other alternative opinions regarding which might have been Shakespeare's final play. Shakespeare might have written Henry VIII, for which he collaborated with Fletcher, one of his contemporaries, after he wrote The Tempest. He could have written another collaborative play, The Two Noble Kinsmen, after he had written The Tempest. So these possibilities have surfaced now, and the old theory is gradually being replaced. Now, there are many things to say about The Tempest. My focus here will be on a very narrow area. Now, for those who are not familiar with the story of The Tempest, it's about Prospero, whose name has connections with prosperity and prospering, being exiled. He was the Duke of Milan, and his brother Antonio, in a conspiracy that he had hatched with Alonso, the King of Naples, had exiled Prospero to an island. He had been shipwrecked, and he had been marooned on an island, and he had with him at the time his daughter Miranda. So when the play begins, Miranda and Prospero, Miranda is a little over 12 years old. It's been 12 years since the two of them had landed on the island. So they are the inhabitants of the island, the only proper human inhabitants of the island. There's also an airy spirit called Ariel, who had been confined within the bark of a tree by a witch called Sycorax, who had inhabited the island for a while, but she is now dead. But while she was on the island, she had given birth to a son, a very deformed and savage creature called Caliban. Prospero had freed Ariel from his imprisonment and turned him into a servant. And he had turned Caliban into a slave. And there's this very nuanced difference in the play, which the play tries to work out. And it's also for the audience and the readers to work out this nuanced difference between Ariel, who is a servant, and Caliban, who is a slave. And Ariel indeed is addressed as a servant, as a spirit, by Prospero, while Caliban is repeatedly addressed as a servant. And while Ariel seeks his freedom but is also very fond of Prospero, Caliban, the slave, detests Prospero and even plots to murder Prospero with the help of a drunkard called Stefano and a jester called Trinculo. Now, as the play opens, there's a tempest. And in the tempest, there's a shipwreck. In the ship are King Alonso of Naples, Antonio, Prospero's brother, who is now the Duke of Milan, having usurped that position from Prospero. There's also Sebastian, who is King Alonso's brother. And there is the master of the ship, there's the boatswain, the other sailors, and other lords and other sundry people on the vessel. And there's a storm raging, a very fierce storm, and there's chaos all around and shouting. The people are calling for one another, calling for the ropes and other tools which might help steady the ship, but nothing of the sort happens. And the people on board the ship fear that their companions are killed. I mean, the people are separated into small groups, and each group, comprising 2 or 3 members, fears that the people in the other groups are all killed, drowned in the sea. That's the first scene of the play. It's a scene of chaos, disorder. It's a scene of uncertainties. It's a scene which is also very, very visually attractive. There could have been different ways of staging the scene in Shakespeare's time. Technology of the kind that we have today was not available. But there could have been cruder ways of staging the storm, with sounds being produced from the back of the stage and torches, moshal, being flashed from behind the stage to create effects of lightning. Huge drums filled with stones could be rolled to produce the grating sound of thunder. That's what was done on the Shakespearean stage. Whenever there were scenes which had the stage direction saying thunder, we have so many such directions in Macbeth, for example, thunder and lightning was suggested by torches being flashed onto the stage. The plays, mind you, were performed in broad daylight, not on rainy days such as the one we're experiencing now, but on bright sunny afternoons in English summers. And so it's through the words, the lines, that Shakespeare, he had to go to the trouble of doing this. It's through the words and through the lines, through images, that he had to create illusions of different times of the day. So when Macbeth, which is, you're all familiar with that play, those of you who are doing the undergraduate program here. When Macbeth, for example, says, come stealing night, scarf up the tender eye of pitiful day, the audience is absorbed into that illusion. With the sun shining bright up above their heads, they still are sucked into an imaginary late evening with night fast setting in. So that's the kind of trick that Shakespeare repeatedly plays on his audience. Horatio, towards the beginning of Hamlet, points in a certain direction where there are supposed mountains. There are no mountains there around the public playhouse. There were no mountains there, and there still are no mountains in England. But when Horatio says, but look, the morn in russet mantle clad walks o'er the dew of yon high eastward hill, or when Juliet says, night's candles are burnt out, it's Romeo who says this, and jocund day walks tiptoe on the misty mountain tops, they are all creating illusions of early morning or late evening or a certain place. For example, when the Duke in As You Like It talks of the Forest of Arden, the audience really believes that they're in the Forest of Arden. They can see the barks of the trees, the rocks, the stones, when the Duke says, we shall find tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, etc. So Shakespeare created visual effects through words, and so any sort of conjecture over how the spectacular storm that we have at the beginning of the play could have been produced on the stage, or for that matter, the storm in King Lear could be produced on the stage, is actually beside the point. Granville Barker had a wonderful essay that he wrote on King Lear in the early 20th century, where he offered suggestions regarding how the storm in King Lear might be staged. And he says there that Lear becomes the storm. He was refuting earlier apprehensions that the storm was unstageable. Now the Tempest, in spite of the storm and the shipwreck and the roaring violent sea, the island, in spite of the eagle landing at the banquet, Ariel in the form of an eagle, the harpy is an eagle, in spite of Ariel floating through the air, in spite of Caliban being almost half fish and half human, he is repeatedly described as being fish-like. In spite of all this, and all this would suggest that it would be very difficult to put together the Tempest on the stage. In spite of all this, the Tempest is primarily a play for the theatre. And this is largely because of the fact that it makes for wonderful spectacle. It makes for great viewing. And as I was saying, there is no need really to make Ariel fly through the air. And it couldn't be done in any way in 1611. So it's the words that make the audience think that occasionally they are seeing Ariel moving through the air, even when Ariel is not actually doing that. Ariel is standing and moving around on the stage, just as Prospero and Ferdinand and Miranda are doing. But this special quality that he has of flying through the air is only spoken of, only mentioned. Prospero tells him to fly away on his errands. And the audience believes, as Ariel leaves through one of the two doors at the back of the stage and goes off stage, that he has really flown away. That's the power of Shakespeare's language. Now, there are many things that we may talk about while discussing The Tempest. There's, for example, the genre of the play. Romance as a genre was not known in Shakespeare's time. There were only two genres that classical literary criticism had made us aware of, or made the Elizabethans aware of, and these were tragedy and comedy. Only two genres of drama, that is. And there was no third genre that Aristotle or Horace had spoken of. And during the English Renaissance, not the European Renaissance on the whole, but the English Renaissance exclusively, there was the emergence of a new genre, the chronicle play, which later metamorphosed into a slightly more mature version of itself and began to be called the history play. So, as we leave the English Renaissance behind and move into the period of the Restoration, we see only three available genres of drama. And then, of course, there were mixed dramas, mixed plays, mingled genres, which is probably ridiculed by Polonius in Hamlet when he talks of comical, historical, tragical, pastoral, etc. Yes, there was pastoral drama, but that was within the larger fold of the genre of comedy. We have the pastoral mode, for example, in As You Like It. But As You Like It is a comedy. When the first folio of Shakespeare's plays was published in 1623, 6 years after his death in 7 years after his death in 1616, The Tempest was the first play in the table of contents. And in the table of contents, we had first the comedies, and then the histories, and then the tragedies. The histories in the middle, because the histories were capable of stretching both ways, in the direction of comedies and in the direction of tragedies. So The Tempest, along with the other three late plays that Shakespeare wrote, The Winter's Tale, Cymbeline, and Pericles, were for a long time called the comedies. Pericles, mind you, was not included in the first folio. It was added to the Shakespearean canon only at a later stage, when it was absolutely certain that Shakespeare was the author. So the point here is that now when we talk of these last 4 plays by Shakespeare as romances, we ought to remember that the term romance and the way in which it came to be applied to these 4 plays was a much later development. So it was only later, much later, that these plays came to be called romances. And there are certain reasons why these plays are called romances. There are certain features that they have in common which they do not share with the other plays in the Shakespearean canon. For example, there's a lot of fantasy in these plays. There is a comic plot, lovers, initial resistance to their relationship, especially by parents, and then finally the happy union of lovers. Here we have the union of Ferdinand and Miranda, for example. Initially, there is a bit of resistance because Alonso, who is the King of Naples and Ferdinand's father, wouldn't want Miranda, who is the daughter of the banished Duke of Milan, Prospero, to marry Ferdinand. He says no such thing in the play because by the time that he comes to know of the betrothal, he is already a much changed person. But initially we suspect, had he come to know of it at an earlier stage, he might have resisted the marriage. Prospero pretends to resist the marriage, but he's happy with the way things are working out between Ferdinand and Miranda. Now, to cut a long story short, another very important feature of these romances is the theme or the motive of sudden discovery. And if you read these romances, I'm not elaborating on that now, because I have to get along with the discussion of the Tempest that I have designed for this presentation. But by sudden discovery, we mean some very strange things. For example, the sudden discovery in The Winter's Tale that Hermione is alive. The sudden discovery in The Tempest by Alonso that Ferdinand is alive. And there are all kinds of sudden discoveries, sudden and mostly happy discoveries in these romances. So there's the love theme, there's the element of fantasy and imagination, fairies, supernatural creatures. We have a fair supply of that in The Tempest, and these sudden discoveries. And there's something that's not often talked about these last plays, and that is, and if you read The Tempest, the text of The Tempest, while being familiar with the texts of some of the earlier plays by Shakespeare, you will know what I mean. Shakespeare brings together in these last plays several elements from the earlier plays. Not only elements of plot, not only minor strands of theme, but also elements of language, phrasing. When I read The Tempest for the first time, that was during my undergraduate program, we had Macbeth and As You Like It on our syllabus, but I read several of Shakespeare's other plays, and I was struck by the way Shakespeare weaves into the textual fabric of The Tempest lines, phrases from the plays that he had written earlier. And this is something you would find also in the other 3 romances, Winter's Tale, Cymbeline, and Pericles. There is also the dominant theme of magic, and you can talk about how magic was understood in Shakespeare's time. Magic in The Tempest, of course, very obviously contributes to the motive of fantasy and strange discoveries. In fact, the storm at the beginning of The Tempest is not a natural storm in the strict sense of that term. It's a storm that's created by Prospero's magic. Prospero is a magician. He is a scholar. He has a library in Milan, but he can't access that library now because he has been banished. And an old faithful lord called Gonzalo had supplied him with some of the books from his own library that's from Prospero's library, when Prospero was being banished by his brother. And so when he left Milan and finally landed on this island, he had not only with him his little daughter, who was then barely a few months old, but also some of the books from his library. And now on the island for these 12 years, he has made the study of those books his primary occupation. And there are references throughout the text of the play to Prospero being engaged with his books. Towards the end of the play, he gives up his magic. Now that's another section which has invited parallels between Shakespeare and Prospero. If you think of Shakespeare in a somewhat exaggerated manner of eulogizing as a magician with words and as a magician with his craft, you could draw a parallel between Prospero the magician and Shakespeare the magician. And Shakespeare surely had fans, as we say now, in his own time. This new discipline of study is fast catching up. Fandom studies, and there has been research on fandom in Shakespeare's time. Shakespeare's fans, or Macbeth's fans, or Hamlet's fans, just as there are fans of celebrities nowadays, so also playwrights in those days. And the characters that they put on the stage have their fans, and there have emerged from the metaphorical closets of that dusty past documents that have supported claims about the existence of fans and this culture of fandom, even in early modern England. Now, this speech by Prospero, where he talks of giving up his art, is another significant speech, like the one where he talks of the revels having ended. And here he breaks his magic staff, that is his magic wand, the stick, and decides to burn his books. Now I'll read this speech for you, just to give you a feel of the kind of personality that Prospero is, the kind of impact that he has had over the play, and the way he relinquishes that power, that hold that he has for such a long while has had on people and on circumstances, on even the order of nature. And he is giving that all up now, and this has prompted speculation that this could indeed be Shakespeare speaking through Prospero about himself, and so this could be his last play. Or even if this were not his last play, Shakespeare was contemplating giving up his career as a playwright and retiring from the theatre. Now, while that may have some truth in it, we can never be sure, because as I said a little while ago, speculation can never usurp the certainty of facts. Prospero addresses elves, little fairy-like creatures that are part of folklore and mythology, and that supposedly inhabit the natural world. Ye elves of hills, brooks, standing lakes and groves, and ye that on the sands with printless foot do chase the ebbing Neptune, and do fly him when he comes back. You demi-puppets that by moonshine do the green sour ringlets make, whereof the yew not bites, and you whose pastime is to make midnight mushrooms, that rejoice to hear the solemn curfew, by whose aid, weak masters though we be. Now he is expressing gratitude to them because they have helped him in his art of magic. And what's the kind of magic that he has performed all through his life? I have bedimmed the noontide sun, called forth the mutinous winds, and twixt the green sea and the azured vault set roaring war. To the dread rattling thunder have I given fire, and rifted Jove's stout oak with his own bolt. The strong-based promontory have I made shake, and by the spurs plucked up the pine and cedar. Graves at my command have waked their sleepers, oped and let him forth by my so potent art. And now comes the decision to put an end to all that magic. But this rough magic I here abjure, and when I have required some heavenly music, as even now I do, to work mine end upon their senses that this airy charm is for, I'll break my staff, bury it certain fathoms in the earth, and deeper than did ever plummet sound, I'll drown my book. So this is a desire to relinquish his art. And one of the things that I would mention here about Prospero is that he is white. And not only is he white, his white color of his skin, and the fact that he is on an island that he is unfamiliar with, and the fact that here he turns two of its earlier inhabitants, Ariel and Caliban, into a servant and a slave respectively, and that he tries to transform the island into one of his own desire, has invited commentary on the Tempest that sees the play as not perhaps as a not so much as a reaffirmation of the virtues or the necessities of colonialism, as a critique of colonialism. As I will say towards the end of this presentation, there's a fair deal of sympathy evoked for Caliban, contrary to older and more traditional Eurocentric readings of the play, which have seen Caliban exactly as he is described in this list of dramatis personae, as a savage creature. And that's the opinion that for a long time stuck in the mind of critics and theatre directors. That seems to have been revised. We'll come to that. Now, for the rest of this presentation, I decided to, this part of the presentation, the lecture, was not a part of my original plan, but I decided to get along with it nonetheless, because I felt that there had to be some sort of initiation into the Tempest, particularly for students unfamiliar with the play. Now, there's a record of a production of the play at court, a private performance, on the 1st of November in 1611. This must have been the first production. It was surely a new play, because now it makes use, the play makes use, I'll tell you how as I proceed, of some accounts of travel that people in England came to know of only in 1610, in late 1610. So that is a bit of evidence to tell us that the play could not have been performed before at least the autumn of 1610. But there are other accounts which tell us that the play was performed on the 1st of November 1611, when there's an interval of a little over a year between the availability of these travel accounts in England and the first performance of the play. So a date of composition can therefore be reasonably be fixed for the Tempest with reasonable accuracy, at least with greater accuracy than may be fixed for some of the other plays of Shakespeare. Now, in 1612 or in 1613 or in the winter of 1612-1613, James I, who was then King of England, he was also King James VI of Scotland at the same time, his daughter Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth, got married to Frederick. Frederick was the Elector Palatine. Now, the Elector Palatine was the ruler of the Elector Palatinate. The Elector Palatinate was Palatinate. It was a constituent state of the Holy Roman Empire until 1803. The ruler of the Elector Palatinate was called the Elector Palatine. It was an office that the ruler held, and James I's daughter was married to the Elector Palatine in 1612 or 13, the winter of 1612-13. And the play The Tempest was produced as part of the festivities, as part of the celebrations for the wedding. And then, of course, it was first published in the first folio of 1623. Like Macbeth, and unlike some of the other plays of Shakespeare, it never had a quarto edition and was published first in the first folio. Now, there are several reasons why it could be the first play in the table of contents in the first folio. Probably because it was very popular at the time that the first folio was being written and was being staged on a regular basis, so that would have accounted for its place at the head of the table of contents in the first folio. We are not delving into other possible reasons, but there could have been a few other reasons as well for that arrangement. Now, the island in The Tempest is a very important place. It's the site, as I have just remarked, of colonial and post-colonial contestation and all the complexities inherent in conceptualizations of colonialism and post-colonialism, and not just conceptualizations, even in the facts of colonialism and post-colonialism. The island, for a long time in criticism of The Tempest and in performance of The Tempest on the stage, has been the site for discussions and polemics on the polemics of colonialism and post-colonialism. But the magic island is an old theme in folklore, in literature. There are so many children's stories around the world where a magical island forms a setting for the story. Now, Shakespeare, when he was writing The Tempest, would surely have been aware of many different treatments of such islands in stories from around the world, particularly from Italy. There were several short stories. I do not by short story mean the kind of story that emerged in the 19th century, which we now call the short story. But there were tales, Italian tales, which Shakespeare frequently drew upon for his plays and used the stories of those plays, particularly in the comedies. So he was aware of what could be done with the island setting, particularly with the magic island setting. What sort of plot could be woven around that setting. And in The Tempest, the magic of the island emanates from Prospero, and in order to understand The Tempest, we have to understand the nature of Prospero's magic and the objectives behind Prospero using that sort of magic, casting a spell on which on people on whom he wishes to take revenge, such as his brother Antonio, the king Alonso, and also he uses his magic to cast spells on Caliban and Ariel. But as I was saying, Prospero is a white man, which makes him a representative in certain ways of the white colonizer. We'll speak about the play's engagement with the theme of colonization and with the post-colonial theme a little later. But first and foremost, as a premise, we need to understand the significance of Prospero being a white man. And it's significant not only in the light of discussions on colonialism and post-colonialism, but also in the light of discussions on the nature of his magic. It is white magic. It is not black magic. And white magic is a magic in which, or in the exercise of which, the magician uses secret powers of nature which he has learned through, or which he has become aware of through laborious study. And he doesn't use this sort of magic for evil purposes, to harm people.
Subhajit, how many times the production of the Tempest was interrupted? Is there any intrinsic evidence? The storm, the rain?
I'm not aware of.
Amidst the tempestuous rain outside, our beloved speaker wanted to have some water. We are glad we could manage some water, and along with it, rose without the thorn. All the thorns. Then why did you want some water? All the thorns have been carefully pared off. Yes. The front of the rose should face the camera. Yes. Thank you.
Prospero, mind you, does not summon evil spirits as a black magician would do. Doesn't summon apparitions as the witches do in Macbeth. Nor does Prospero make any sort of agreement, contract with the devil, as say Faustus does in Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. Essentially, he is projected in the play as a good man, the good, benevolent white man, a man who loves to study, who has a library in Milan, and who has been wrongly thrust out of his dukedom. And although his magic and the actions of his servant Ariel determine to a very large extent, in fact, determine almost entirely the turn of events in the play, there is also, you must remember, a history that the island has, which precedes the coming of Prospero and Miranda to the island. Just as the colonized countries of the world had had their histories before the coming of the colonizers. And the island had been ruled earlier by Sycorax, who never appears on stage. There have been certain productions which are interpretations of the Tempest, which have had an on-stage Sycorax, but then eventually it's the prerogative of the director. In the play that we received from the first folio, and even then we are not sure how much of it was actually written by Shakespeare. We can never be sure of Shakespeare's extent of contribution to any of his plays that we have in the first folio. There was so much of collaboration, so much of interpolation and rewriting and revision. There was so much of uncertainty about about how much of Shakespeare's manuscripts, called the foul papers, had survived. Hemming and Condell, the earliest editors of Shakespeare who put together the plays for the first folio, claimed to have worked from the foul papers, Shakespeare's manuscripts. But even that is a very contentious claim. So we are talking about what we have received from the first folio, rather than what we have received from Shakespeare. And in The Tempest, as we have had it from the first folio, there is no on-stage presence of Sycorax. Sycorax is very consciously only spoken about and never brought onto the stage. She has died, in fact, before the action of the play commences, so there's no way that she could be brought back onto the stage, even though Prospero makes the claim towards the end of the play, in the speech that I've just read, that his magic art has very frequently opened up graves and woken the sleepers in the graves and brought them back to life. Now, Sycorax had been a witch. Now, one could talk about a magician in terms of a wizard, a male magician, but a wizard again is generally a magician, a male witch who performs sorcery or black magic. And Sycorax had been a practitioner of black magic. She had been a witch. And it's for her evil deeds that she had been marooned on the island. Prospero also has been marooned on the island, so to that extent there's a bit of parallelism. But Prospero, and one could indeed build upon that parallelism and provide alternate readings of the relationship between Prospero and Miranda on the one hand, Sycorax and Caliban on the other, with Ariel thrown in for good measure somewhere in between. But to keep it on a more simple level of interpretation, Sycorax was punished for her evil deeds, and she was exiled and put on the island. And it was on the island that she had given birth to Caliban. There's no mention of Caliban's father, just as there is no mention of Miranda's mother. So that again extends that possible parallelism between the two sides. The play treats Sycorax and Caliban as either non-human. Non-human is a word that we use so frequently in critical jargon these days, or at least as subhuman. And Sycorax giving birth to Caliban on the island is spoken of in terms of Sycorax having littered Caliban. It's almost like a puppy being part of a litter that a dog produces. So the word littered carries connotations of the non-human or the subhuman, displacing in a way Sycorax, who is not there in the play's action, and Caliban, who is very much there, displacing both of them from the realm of the human. Ariel too is outside the limits of what constitutes the human. But one important difference between Ariel and Caliban, and they've often been contrasted in popular criticism of the play, is that Ariel is the good spirit, the benign spirit, and he is the servant that Prospero uses in order to further his magic, in order to extend his magic and perpetrate it on the other characters of the play. Caliban is his slave and not his servant. Caliban doesn't serve him in the way, or serve his magic art in the way his servant Ariel does. Caliban is a slave, that the creature that Prospero exploits, makes him fetch logs and other necessities which make Prospero live a life of relative contentment on the island. And Caliban detests the kind of work that he has been doing, for before Prospero came onto this island, he was the one who was the ruler of this island, and now he has been transformed into a slave. And Ariel, whom Caliban's mother had imprisoned, and whom therefore Caliban was also ruling before Prospero came onto this island with Miranda, now is more endeared to Prospero, is Prospero's favorite, while he, Caliban, is chided and rebuked frequently. So that's something which is unbearable for Caliban, and which also could invite sympathy for Caliban, and any amount of sympathy that might build up in the audience or readers for Caliban, particularly readers and audiences in countries outside the Western world, countries that had once been subjected to colonization. Any sort of sympathy building up for Caliban would or could be the essential preliminary for revisionist readings of the play in post-colonial terms. Besides, of course, Ariel, as the name suggests, is a spirit of the air, the upper region of an element from the upper regions of the Earth's atmosphere, while Caliban is rooted to the earth. In fact, there are occasions when Caliban lies down on the earth. Trinculo mistakes him for a fish-like creature. He is lying horizontally on the earth. And that essential animality in Caliban reinforces not only his status as subhuman or non-human, but also makes him engage with another of the five elements, the earth, which is a lower element. while Ariel engages with the air. So these are issues that could be built upon, expanded, and you could move in different directions of critical responses to the play. Caliban's mother, Sycorax, was ugly, and this is hinted at in the play when on 2 occasions Caliban is described as hag-born whelp. Whelp is a term usually used to describe puppies. It's an old word, archaic now. Hag-born, hag, an ugly old woman. Macbeth refers to the witches in Macbeth as hags. You secret black and midnight hags. So he is a hag-born whelp, Caliban. At another point in the play, he is described as hag-seed. He's addressed as hag-seed, seed, the child of a hag. Hag-seed, incidentally, is the name of a 2016 novel by Margaret Atwood, the Canadian author, and that is the novelization of The Tempest. It's called hag-seed, the term being borrowed from a line in Shakespeare's play. Now, the location of the island is ambiguous. Which part of the world is it? It doesn't even have an imaginary name, unlike Illyria in The Tempest. It's not named at all. In some aspects, in some ways, it could be a Mediterranean island, which the shipwrecked party lands upon while traveling from Tunis, which is in Africa, to Naples in Italy. So it could be somewhere in the Mediterranean Sea. Given the place that the party had set out from and the direction in which they had been traveling. But there are certain other ways in which the island, particularly if you give the play a colonial, post-colonial dimension, the play could also, the island could also reflect, could also stand for the Bermuda that is described in 2 pamphlets which Shakespeare would have been aware of. I'll talk of those two pamphlets. Now, on the 2nd of June, 1609, roughly 2 years before Shakespeare's Tempest was performed, there was a company, an organization called the Virginia Company in England, and an expedition of the Virginia Company set out from Plymouth. Plymouth is a place in England, Plymouth, on the 2nd of June, 1609. After a month and a half, or a little over a month and a half, on the 24th of July, the ship was wrecked by a storm. 24th of July, 1609. The storm at the start of the play, the tempest at the start of the play, could be an allusion to that shipwreck. That shipwreck was talked about frequently in England, and before we came to this room an hour ago, that reminds me, how much more time do we have?
Round up by 3 minutes.
So 20 minutes? 20 minutes. So, yes. We were discussing why the play is called The Tempest, when the tempest only occupies the first scene of the play, and there is no tempest. In fact, there seems to be fair weather, interrupted occasionally by thunder in the rest of the play. Now, one of the reasons could be, perhaps, we're not sure, this is again conjecture, that this tempest, which was a real-life tempest and affected the party that was on the expedition, the Virginia Company people, this was being talked about, even 2 years down the line. And so the title of the play could have made the audience immediately recognize a kind of connection between that tempest and something that the play could be about. Now, after the fleet was scattered by a storm, now, since this was an expedition, it was not one ship, but a fleet of vessels. And these vessels were all scattered because of the storm. In the way, after the shipwreck in the Tempest, the occupants of the ship are scattered. And different individuals fear that the other individuals are drowned until they all come onto the stage in flesh and blood towards the end of the play. But even much earlier than that, in the second scene of the play, Prospero tells his daughter Miranda, who is moved to pity by the accident, that no life will be destroyed. So the audience knows that no one will die. The audience anticipates that sort of coming together of the members on board the ship at the end of the play. So this is theatrical irony, something, a kind of a variant of theatrical irony, something that the characters, most of the characters, that is, with the exception of Miranda and Prospero, don't know. But what Prospero and Miranda know, and it's a knowledge that they share with the audience, so the audience also knows that all of them will be alive. And this has an impact on the way we read the rest of the play, the second scene onward. Now the vessels, after being scattered, arrived at a place called Jamestown in August. But there was one vessel missing, and that was the leading ship, the flagship. And on board the flagship, there was the Admiral. The Admiral was Sir George Somers, S-O-M-E-R-S, and he was missing. And also missing with Sir George Somers was the person who was supposed to be the future governor of Virginia, Sir Thomas Gates, G-A-T-E-S. And this flagship was called the Sea Adventure. The is outside the name of the ship. I'm only putting it in front of Sea Adventure, the way we say the Odyssey or the Iliad. So the name was Sea Adventure, and it was presumed that the ship was permanently lost. However, several months later, on the 23rd of May, 1610, two small boats, sailing ships, sailing ships, not really boats, lightweight sailing ships. There's this kind of ship called pinnace, P-I-N-N-A-C-E. So two pinnaces, small pinnaces, appeared at Jamestown, carrying the goods and the sailors of the Sea Adventure. So Sir Thomas Gates returned alive on shore, returned to Jamestown, and so did Sir George Somers. Obviously there are links between what happened there and what happens in the Tempest. The difference being that in the Tempest, it's worked out through Prospero's magic. Now, after their return, Somers recounted that he and his men, who were on board that ship called Sea Adventure, had landed on the island of Bermuda. It was an island which sailors carefully avoided because there had been very bad reports circulating about the island, Bermuda. It was also called the Isle of Devils. Happily, the people who were on board the ship, Somers and Gates and the others, they found no devils on the island. Instead, it appeared to be a very pleasant place. There was food, there was shelter under the trees and under the rocks. They found wood to build the pinnaces in which they returned to Jamestown. They had built those pinnaces, they said, while they were on the island of Bermuda. And this has created the conjecture that the island in the Tempest could be Bermuda, just as it could be some other Mediterranean island. Now this return of Somers and Gates and their companions to Jamestown created quite a sensation, and it was talked about frequently. I talked about two pamphlets that Shakespeare might have been aware of. One was written by a person called Sylvester Jardine Sylvester, Jourdain, Gourdain, who was a member of the crew aboard Sea Adventure. And this was called A Discovery of the Bermudas, comma, otherwise called the Isle of Devils. The Virginia Company, elated over the return of Somers and Gates and Jourdain and the others, they published another pamphlet on their own, the Virginia Company. It was called the True Declaration of the Estate of the Colony in Virginia. The True Declaration of the Estate of the Colony in Virginia. Now there was of course another report by a person called William Strachey, who again was a member of the crew on board Sea Adventure, and this was dated, the pamphlet was, this third pamphlet, it was more of a report really than a pamphlet, was dated 15th July 1610, and it was called The True Repertory of the Wrack. The True Repertory of the Wrack. Wrack is the wreck, the shipwreck, sometimes it's also pronounced shipwreck, all right? The True Repertory of the Wrack and the Redemption of Sir Thomas Gates. And this was circulated only in the form of manuscript and was finally published in 1625 in the book that most of you who have read Coleridge's Kubla Khan would be aware of, Purkas, His Pilgrimage, sometimes called Purkas's Pilgrimage. So that was where this report by William Strachey was published. That indeed was the book that Coleridge was reading, according to his own claim, when he fell asleep. These pamphlets also mention Dido and Aeneas. Dido, you know, Queen of Carthage. Carthage being a few miles away from Tunis in Africa, roughly around 9.5 miles away from Tunis. And her legendary love relationship with Aeneas, the founder of the Roman Empire, whom Virgil had written about in the Aeneid. So these pamphlets mention Dido and Aeneas as early colonizers. That's important. And this may be related in certain ways to Shakespeare probably mixing the plot, the story of the Tempest, or infusing into the story of the Tempest aspects of the discovery of the New World. The New World, you know, the world in the Western Hemisphere, all right? The Americas, for example, discovered by Columbus. So during the Renaissance, these new places were being discovered, and they came to be called the New World. Miranda, when she meets all the other characters of the play, so far she had seen only her father, the only human character that she had ever seen. And then a little earlier in the play, she had seen Ferdinand, whom she had fallen in love with. And yes, this play is one of those two plays by Shakespeare, the other being the Comedy of Errors, that adheres to the Aristotelian unities of time, place, and action. More or less, not very thoroughly, but more or less. The action of the play is spread over some 4 or 5 hours. Everything happens within that range of time. And when the other members of the ship that was shipwrecked in the first scene of the play come and meet Prospero, Ferdinand, and Miranda, Ferdinand and Miranda are discovered in a cave, which would be the room at the back of the Shakespearean stage, which had a curtain in front, sometimes called the inner chamber. They're playing a game of chess there, and the curtain is drawn apart, and Prospero shows them to Alonso. Alonso is surprised at the discovery that his son, Ferdinand, is alive. He had taken him to be dead and had reconciled himself to his grief. Now he finds him alive. So that's one of the discoveries. And Miranda, on seeing so many humans in front of her for the first time, exclaims that it's a wonderful sight and says, "Oh, brave new world," which is, of course, as you know, probably the title of a book by Aldous Huxley, Brave New World. But the words are from the Tempest. So the theme of New World discovery, the theme of colonization, These are all woven into the texture of the Tempest. Now, for the rest of this presentation, just around 15 minutes, will that do? I'll talk a little about this element of the New World and colonization. Now, the influence or the inspiration to write about the New World probably came from Montaigne, Michel de Montaigne, the French Renaissance essayist, whose essays were translated into English in 1603 by an Englishman called John Florio, and Shakespeare would have read Montaigne's essays in Florio's English translation of 1603. And one of those essays was called Of Here Is About, of Cannibals, sometimes printed as Of the Cannibals. Now this is a piece of primitivist writing. Now, primitivism is essentially, in Western philosophy, primitivism proposes that people of primitive societies were not only innocent and naive in certain ways, but they possessed a morality, a sense of ethics that was superior to the value systems held by people in urban and supposedly civilized societies. So primitivism is essentially an appreciation, a praise of primitive people and primitive ways of life. And this is the substance of Montaigne's essay of Cannibals. Now, it is essentially also Montaigne's praise of primitive American Indian, that is Red Indian, American Indian society, as he had heard it described or written about. Now, cannibal, the word, etymologically, has little to do with eating human flesh. It is related etymologically to the word Carib, from where we have the other derivative word Caribbean, the Caribbean islands, for example, the West Indies. We're not going into that part of the discussion, but when he talks of the region inhabited by the cannibals, and he doesn't here mean flesh-eating people or people eating human flesh, he's actually referring to people of the Caribbean. And he thinks of those primitive people there as people of an ideal society and people of an ideal state, which is superior to the republic that Plato envisioned. And I'm reading a section of this essay where Montaigne writes, and this is the English translation by Florio, "It is a nation, would I answer Plato, that hath no kind of traffic, no knowledge of letters, no intelligence of numbers, no name of magistrate, nor of politic superiority, no use of service, of riches or of poverty, no contracts, no successions, no partitions, no occupation but idle, no respect of kindred but common, no apparel but natural, no manuring of lands, no use of wine, corn, or metal." It's a pre-industrial society. They don't even have clothes on their bodies. No apparel but natural. It's almost animalistic, in no way resembling anything for which the human was glorified in Shakespeare's time or in Montaigne's time by humanist philosophers. But that's of course another story for another day. And this description by Montaigne is also surely the source that Shakespeare found for Gonzalo's brief description of the ideal commonwealth in Act 2, Scene 1 of The Tempest, where Gonzalo says, "In the commonwealth I would by contraries execute all things, for no kind of traffic would I admit, no name of magistrate. Letters should not be known, riches, poverty, and use of service none. Contract, succession, bourne, that is boundaries. Bound of land, tilth, vineyard, none. No use of metal, corn, wine, or oil. No occupation, all men idle and women too, but innocent and pure. No sovereignty. Note how Gonzales, or Shakespeare, while putting these words into Gonzales's mouth, almost borrows verbatim from Montaigne. Now, Caliban was often, and still is often, the major figure in two dominant interpretations of the Tempest that began to appear in the late 19th century and flourished in the 20th century. One is that the play is about the New World. And the second is that the play symbolizes European or American, and by American I mean the United States, imperialism or racism. And it could imply racism and imperialism in any part of the world, perpetrated by either any European country or by the United States. And the play could speak for that sort of imperialism or colonization. The play could speak about the New World. These were the two dominant strands of critical reception that the play had since the late 19th century and right through the 20th and even into the 21st. And there was this emphatic identification of the world of the Tempest with the New World. And the focus in any kind of interpretation of the Tempest was, any kind of interpretation, by that I mean any one of these two kinds of interpretation of the Tempest that I've just mentioned, the focus was on Caliban. As critics began to take note of resemblances between the crudity and the materialism and the military aggression of the United States in those years on the one hand, and similar traits in Caliban on the other. So Caliban became a representative of all that was ugly and abominable about the United States. Prospero on the one hand, and Miranda and Ferdinand began to be seen as symbols of everything that was good and noble about Latin America or about the Hispanic states. This was, of course, the perspective of critics, particularly from Latin America. Latin American culture, in contrast to North America, was gentle. This was the reading that was offered. It was inspired, the Latin American culture inspired comparison with traits identifiable not only in Prospero and Miranda and Ferdinand, but also in Ariel. And this helped further the divide between Ariel and Caliban. And the contrast between the two of them, between Caliban and Ariel, was elaborated upon in a book called Ariel that was published in 1900. And the book argued that while Caliban's sensuality, his crude sensuality, his grossness, epitomized the most disgraceful features of American civilization, or Anglo-American civilization, European civilization, Ariel represented the polite and the honorable aspects of Latin American culture, Latin American civilization. Another book that I'll mention is a book written by a Venezuelan. He was a doctor, writer, he was a journalist, he was also a literary critic, a person called Jesus Maria Sempram Pulgar. You will find a mention of him in the introduction to the most recent ardent edition of The Tempest. It's a wonderful introduction, it's over 100 pages long, and you'll find an elaboration of some of the things that I'm talking about now in this introduction, particularly in the latter half of the introduction. Now, he condemned this person called Jesus Maria Sempram Pulgar. He condemned the Anglo-Americans in his book called Cultura Venezolana. Cultura Venezolana. That's the culture of Venezuela. It was written in 1918, published at least in 1918. Could have been written a little earlier than that. And he condemned the culture of the Anglo-Americans in these terms, inviting comparison with Caliban. I'm quoting, rough and obtuse Calibans. He called the Anglo-Americans rough and obtuse Calibans, swollen by brutal appetites, the enemies of all idealisms, furiously enamored of the dollar. They're all fond of the dollar, he says. Insatiable gulpers of whiskey and sausages. Swift, overwhelming, fierce, clownish. Now, an English translation of this book, the passage that I read, is from that English translation of the book, which appeared in 1959. It was a book. It was a translation by a person called Donald Dozer, D-O-S-E-R, and the title of this English translation was "Are We Good Neighbors?" ? 3 centuries of inter-American relations, 1930-1960. That is North and South America, Latin America, and the United States. Now, one name that you cannot miss and shouldn't miss when talking about the history of the critical reception of The Tempest is that of Sidney Lee, who was a very influential biographer of Shakespeare, and in 1898 wrote a book called Life of William Shakespeare, which had a section on The Tempest which cast considerable influence for a long time. He also wrote a number of essays on The Tempest, and in the book called The Life of William Shakespeare, and in some of his subsequent essays, he argued that Shakespeare had wanted The Tempest to reflect England's early years of colonial experience. This was a statement that he vehemently made. He argued, I repeat, that Shakespeare had wanted The Tempest, the play, The Tempest, to reflect England's early years of colonial experience, or early experience of colonialism. And the play's characters, Sidney Lee argued, represent the perpetrators of colonialism in its early years. And he further argued that the island in The Tempest, we have been talking of the identity of the island a little while ago. Sidney Lee argued that the island in The Tempest was supposed to be either somewhere off the North American coast, or somewhere, and this is interesting, the second possibility, somewhere in an imagined amalgamation of England and America. Now, England and America are very far apart. It takes many hours to reach America from England and vice versa. So you cannot amalgamate England and America geographically. That's an impossibility. Sidney Lee argues that this island could be an imagined amalgamation of some place in England and America, because they were the perpetrators of the sort of imperialism that the play projects. Rudyard Kipling also subscribed to conjecture in his book, which not too many people are aware of. It's a book that was published in 1898, and it's called How Shakespeare Came to Write The Tempest. And he insisted, almost unambiguously, that Bermuda was the play's location. Sidney Lee made one important statement. He said, every explorer shared Prospero's pity for the aborigines' inability to make themselves intelligible in their crabbed dialects, and offered them instruction in civilized speech. So he tries to make a case for the colonizers' effort to civilize the natives, who are supposedly less civilized than the colonizer is. And Prospero is a person who has some sort of pity for the aborigines' inability to make themselves intelligible in their own crabbed dialects. And so Prospero offers Caliban instruction in civilized speech, and Caliban says, you taught me language and I have learned to curse. This is what Macaulay tried to do in India, for example. Let's move on now to a very important book. Now we could go on and on, of course, but brevity is the soul of wit. I'll talk about brevity is the soul of wit is a line from Hamlet, spoken by Polonius, who is never brief, but he says brevity is the soul of wit. Octave Manoni, Mannoni, is a very important figure when it comes to, he was a French social scientist. He's a very important figure when it comes to taking note of the recent history of colonialist and post-colonialist readings of the Tempest. And I'll be very quick with this, but I'll talk about it because this is necessary as some sort of background to understanding why we are grappling with these kinds of readings of the Tempest now. He was a French social scientist, and he wrote about France's colonial rule and France's administration, French administration of the African island of Madagascar. And this book, which was originally in French, published in 1950, was called Psychologie de la Colonisation, which translated into English would obviously be The Psychology of Colonization. But when it was translated into English in 1956, and this was not a literary book at all, it was of course a non-literary book, a book about politics, a book about social life. When it was translated into English in 1956, it had a very provocative title and invited immediate comparison with Shakespeare's Tempest. It was translated as Prospero and Caliban. That was the English version of the book. So this non-literary book with a literary title had, as one would expect, enormous impact on readings of the Tempest in the following decades, including readings by directors preparing to put the play on the stage. Mannoni focuses on the colonial experience in Madagascar exclusively. He's not talking about other parts of the world, but the scope of his study in the book encompasses a general study of colonization, a study of the lives of the natives under colonial rule in a more general way, although his immediate focus is only on Madagascar. The scope of his study encompasses different kinds of personalities that emerge from the context of colonialism. Prospero, one would argue, The Tempest emerges from a context of colonialism, not directly from the plot of the play, but from the reverberations that colonialism has had in the 19th and 20th centuries and the 21st. So it's hardly surprising then that we should read Prospero as a colonizer and Caliban as a representative of colonized natives that we now perhaps need to sympathize with, and we should therefore displace Prospero from the center of our critical attention on the Tempest and bring Caliban into the center. And that's what has been done in recent times in critical studies. So Mannoni talks about the dominating, the unsympathetic colonizers and the submissive, the passive natives, and points out a certain ambivalence in the condition of the colonized natives who are torn between the Western values of the colonizers and their own indigenous cultures, who are resentful of the colonizers, who dislike the colonizers, but at the same time are indignant over their own selves because they are submissive and passive, and so they hate themselves for being submissive and passive as much as they hate the colonizers for dominating them. And this is the ambiguity that tears the colonized natives apart. This is the psychology, the essence of the psychology that Mannoni is pointing out. And conventional readings of The Tempest, following Mannoni's influential book and its the provocative English title of its English translation, have led to conventional older readings of The Tempest being very powerfully challenged in the second half of the 20th century and in the 21st century up to our present day by what we would call counter readings, counter interpretations, in which, as I remarked a few moments ago, Caliban and not Prospero is at the center of the play. He is, it's not so much the figure of Caliban, the tangible body, although much is made of that tangible body in the play, but it's the spirit that Caliban represents that's brought into the center of the play at the expense of the now displaced spirit of the colonizer, or the representative of the colonizer, Prospero. And there have been appropriations of the play and of the symbols that Shakespeare uses in the play by African critics, by Caribbean critics, writers, even by writers such as Margaret Atwood in her book called Hagseed. Much of this has been in response to the provocation offered by Manoni's book. And Manoni very correctly diagnosed the uprising in Madagascar, called the Madagascan Uprising of 1947-48, around the same time, a few months after, actually, India gaining political independence. And Manoni read in the Madagascan Uprising a sign of, or an anticipation of, the death of French colonialism. French colonialism, Manoni said, would end. And he also read in that uprising the birth of Madagascan independence and African nationalism. And his book, particularly when you take note of the title of the English translation, Prospero and Caliban, the book seems to suggest that Shakespeare's Tempest is an allegory of colonial relations between the colonizer and the colonized. And it's also an allegory of the psychology of the colonial master and the colonized slave, or even the colonized servant. The colonized servant probably fits in somewhere between the slave, who could be the manual laborer, the physical laborer, and so that's the slave. And the colonial servant, represented by Ariel, could be someone like, say, during the days of the Raj in India, the Indian babus who flattered the English, but were not really slaves or made to do any kind of menial work, but still were under the dominance of the colonizers. So the project of revising our readings of the Tempest and placing Caliban at the center of the discourse in the play is a very significant reversal. It's a transgressive reading, a reading that transgresses boundaries established by the grain of Western and Eurocentric readings of the play. It's a transgressive reading because it cuts against the grain, it cuts severely against the grain of Western cultural history and Western political history, or the history that Western historiography had engraved upon particularly the Western imagination. That has been challenged now by post-colonial readings of the play. And it does not appear surprising that the central assumption, the older assumption that Shakespeare's play was fully complicit in building up the myth of the benevolent colonizer, or of benevolent colonialism, in building up the myth that the foreign conqueror had a certain right to the land and to the labor and to the lives of the native peoples who were supposedly less civilized than himself. That assumption has now been overthrown, and so Manoni's influence in critical thoughts in colonialism and post-colonialism was a net that he had cast wide. And soon after the publication of the book in 1950 and after its English translation, post-colonial interpretations of the Tempest began to dominate responses both in the realms of the performed Shakespeare as well as in the realm of the academic Shakespeare, if at all we can make such a distinction perhaps is no longer legitimate, because the academic Shakespeare has absorbed the performed Shakespeare, and the performed Shakespeare has also absorbed the academic Shakespeare. But all around the world now, critics of the Tempest, Shakespearean scholars, have woken up to this possibility that the Tempest does not suggest that Shakespeare was upholding what has now emerged as a myth, the myth of the benevolence of the noble colonizer. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Already our enormously learned speaker has pushed the boundaries of the new world, and we are at 3:45. Alright? So if you have any quick question, one or two, that's all. That's all what we can accommodate. 2 to 3 questions. Any question, if any question at all. See, if there is any confusion, please do not lay at the speaker's door, because he was full of clarity. Alright? He spoke so well today. I mean, having known him for years, alright? We are grateful to him. Yes? He does it always. Yes. Clarity is always there. My teacher, also his teacher, is correcting me on this code. But I do not have...
Even if they have no questions, I'll be happy, Arjuna, if whatever they've heard inspires them to read The Tempest and look into its possibilities.
Right.
Because we feel that they haven't yet read The Tempest. Is that right? Yes.
No, some of them should, because it is in the PG course.
Are there PG students here?
Yes, of course.
So I have just a few simple observations. First is about romance. Although dramatic romance as a genre possibly was not mentioned in Shakespeare, only tragedy. The romance genre was only there. The romance genre. That's recording. This is after everything goes. The romance genre was already present, and possibly Shakespeare was mixing the romance genre into his comic. Into his comic, mixing. For example, in the course of this talk, we mentioned about Dido, and I think there were early Greek romances, and Odysseus and Odyssey, full of romance episodes, which are part of the picture. Shakespeare was incorporating these romance elements into romance. The second is about slave and servant. I think slave is being a servant, there's nothing contractual. The servant and the master. In slave, there's nothing. It's completely bonded. A white man can be a servant, not a black. In fact, during this time, the word became very popular in the Indian times, black and moon. But the black people, curious people, as you said, subhuman. Finally, about this, before coming, as you mentioned, before coming, we're discussing on the title. Why this Tempest? You're also wondering. Then you mentioned that this Tempest at the beginning. So one of suggested that this Tempest is not natural or supernatural, which you also mentioned. No, I think in the light of trauma, I think Prospero had suffered with trauma when he was resolved. The trauma theory came into existence in the late 1890s with Freud. And Freud refers to a girl who was inappropriately touched when she was 4, but which she did not register in her consciousness. It was there in her subconscious. And 4 years later, when she was 8, when she went to a shop again, and the people were smiling and laughing at people, she thought that the same event was being repeated. Then she had that trauma. I have a feeling that in the context of trauma theory, if we want to interpret it like that, Prospero had this trauma inside him. And this trauma came back when he realized that the same people who had usurped him back at you, and I was going to exert the life. And therefore, the fear, not the fear, the rage, and the tempestuous rage in which he creates the magic. That's the magic. Pandit.
I must be very rude, Subhajit, because I have to stop this event here. You can continue this discussion in the department or on the sidelines. For the simple reason, it is now 4 o'clock and they have their tiffin bell ringing.
Okay.
But the happy news is that we have mocha chop for all of the participants here, and it will grow further cold, you know.
All right.
So let us all gradually walk towards the department, and you can discuss the genre theory there.
Okay, and I thank the head of the department and the department as a whole for inviting me to deliver this talk on the Tempest, and I suppose that we're meeting tomorrow.
Sure.
At 2 o'clock again for a discussion on Antony and
Thank you.
Cleopatra. Thank you.